$50. That's what the auctioneer's gavel landed on for Unit 214. Cody Marsh stood at the back of the crowd at Buckeye Self-Storage, on the edge of Toledo, Ohio, holding a coffee cup he'd refilled 3 times at the gas station down the road just to have a reason to stand somewhere warm. He was 23. 6 months earlier, he'd been sleeping in his car. 3 months earlier, the car got repossessed. Now he slept behind the loading dock of a furniture warehouse on nights. The security guard didn't do his rounds. And on nights the guard did, he walked. He wasn't at the auction to buy anything. He didn't have $50, let alone the kind of money the other bidders were throwing around. He was there because a guy named Perry, who fixed bikes out of a shopping cart near the underpass, told him storage auctions sometimes had furniture people dumped instead of paying their late fees, and furniture could be sold for cash. Cody figured he'd watch, learn how it worked, maybe flip something small next month if he ever had $10 to bid with. 6 months earlier, none of this would have made sense to him. He'd had an apartment on the west side of Toledo, a job running the loading dock at a distribution center, and a routine so ordinary he never thought to be grateful for it. The distribution center cut back after a contract fell through, and he was one of 11 people let go on the same Friday. He figured he'd find something within a month. He didn't. Rent doesn't wait for a job search to work out, and by the 3rd missed payment the apartment wasn't his anymore. He moved into the car. Then the car got towed for expired tags he couldn't afford to renew, and by the time he got it out of the impound lot, the fees had eaten what was left of his savings, and 2 weeks after that the car got repossessed outright. There wasn't one moment where his life fell apart. It was a slow unraveling of small ordinary things, each one pulling the next one down with it. By the time he was standing at the back of that auction crowd, he'd stopped expecting anything to turn around fast. He was just trying to get through each week without losing more ground than he'd gained. So when the gavel came down on Unit 214, and it was his, the feeling wasn't excitement. It was closer to disbelief, the kind where you check your pocket twice to make sure the money's actually gone and the thing is actually yours. Unit 214 went up near the end, after the crowd had thinned. The auctioneer read off the file. Rent unpaid since March. No response from the tenant. Contents unknown. Sold as is. Someone in a flannel jacket bid $20. A woman in a Buckeye Storage polo shirt bid $30 just to keep it moving. Nobody else wanted it. The auctioneer looked around, said going once, going twice, and Cody, without really deciding to, said $50. He said it because he had exactly $53 in his pocket from 2 days of unloading trucks at a produce warehouse, and because something about the silence in the room made him not want to just stand there and watch. The auctioneer pointed at him. Sold to the young man in the back. The woman in the polo shirt walked him to the unit and cut the lock with a bolt cutter, and that was when Cody found out Unit 214 wasn't 10 feet by 10 feet like the small ones. It was one of the 10 by 20 units at the end of the row, the kind meant for a whole household's furniture, the kind that most people at the auction had walked past, because 10 by 20 units usually cost more to bid on, not less. Nobody had wanted this one, because the tenant listed on file had abandoned a stack of water-damaged boxes near the door, and from the smell, everyone assumed the whole thing was ruined. It wasn't ruined. It was mostly empty. Cody stood in the doorway after the storage employee left him alone to clean it out by Friday, and he understood, standing there in the gray light coming through the open roll-up door, that he was looking at 4 solid walls, a concrete floor, and a ceiling higher than his head by 3 feet. No windows. No one could see in once the door came down. It was March in northern Ohio, and the wind cutting across the gravel lot outside had teeth in it. And inside that box, for the first time in 6 months, there was no wind at all. He didn't decide to live there, not at first. He told himself he was just going to sleep one night while he sorted through the water-damaged boxes for anything worth selling. He pulled the door most of the way down, left a 2-inch gap because something in him didn't like the idea of sealing himself into a metal box completely, and he lay down on a stack of flattened cardboard in the corner. He woke up 9 hours later, warmer and more rested than he'd been in half a year, And that was the night everything changed, even though nothing about his situation had changed yet at all. The facility had rules: no overnight occupancy, gate code access only between 6 in the morning and 10 at night, security cameras at the corners of the building. Though Cody noticed within the first week that the camera covering row 2, where his unit sat, had a dead angle right at his door because of the way the light pole blocked the lens. He didn't plan around that on purpose. He just noticed it the way you notice things when staying unnoticed has become a full-time skill. For the first 2 weeks, he treated it like a secret he wasn't sure he'd get to keep. He came in after the gate closed by climbing the fence at the back corner where the chain link had rusted loose from the post, and he left before 6 by the same route, walking 2 miles to the warehouse where he'd been picking up day labor whenever trucks came in. He kept nothing valuable inside in case someone found it and cleared it out. He kept the boxes from the previous tenant stacked near the door, so a glance inside looked like ordinary abandoned junk, not a place somebody slept. The cold was the first real problem. April in Toledo doesn't warm up the way people assume, and a sealed metal box with no insulation gets colder at night than the air outside, because the concrete floor pulls heat out of a body faster than open ground does. Cody found this out the hard way, waking up at 2 in the morning with his hands numb, teeth going, and he understood that surviving inside the unit long-term meant solving the heat problem, or eventually not waking up from it. He didn't have money for a space heater. He had $11 and a library card. He went to the library on Monroe Street because it was warm and free, and he searched for how people insulate spaces without power, and what he found scared him almost as much as the cold did. Every serious answer said the same thing: don't use combustion heat in a sealed space without ventilation, because carbon monoxide doesn't smell like anything, and it kills people in their sleep. That single fact reshaped everything he did after. So he built the problem in layers instead of chasing one fix. First, the floor. Concrete was stealing more warmth than the air was, so he laid down a pallet he found behind a hardware store, then flattened cardboard on top of that, then a moving blanket he bought for $4 at a thrift store on Lagrange Street. That alone changed the coldest hours of the night more than anything else he tried. Second, the walls. He couldn't insulate steel, but he could break up the dead air pocket that made the metal feel like it was radiating cold directly at him. He hung moving blankets on the 2 walls closest to where he slept, using the same kind of spring clamps painters use, bought 3 for $1 each. It wasn't insulation in any technical sense. It just stopped the metal from being the last thing his skin touched all night. Third, and this took him longest to figure out safely, was actual heat. He didn't touch propane or any open flame, not after what he'd read at the library. The warnings weren't vague. People die in sealed spaces from combustion heat because carbon monoxide builds up faster than a small gap under a door can clear it, and it does its damage without any smell or warning to wake a person up. Cody decided early that no fix was worth trying, if it meant guessing about that. He found the actual answer almost by accident, standing around a pallet of drywall waiting for a truck to back in. A guy on the crew named Wallace, older, quiet, the kind of person who'd clearly worked more job sites than he'd ever talk about, mentioned that his foreman threw out a whole box of cordless tool batteries the week before because they wouldn't hold a full charge anymore. Still got juice in them, Wallace said, just not enough for a drill anymore. Guys tossed them instead of dealing with it. Cody asked where. Wallace looked at him for a second too long, then just told him which dumpster, no questions asked. Cody started collecting them. Within 2 weeks, he had 11 dead but not dead batteries and a $5 charging dock from a pawn shop on Airport Highway. He wired them into a 12-volt heated blanket, the kind people use in cars, running off the batteries instead of an outlet. It wasn't much. It raised the temperature under the blanket by maybe 15 degrees, but 15 degrees was the difference between shivering until dawn and actually sleeping, and it came with no flame, no fumes, nothing that needed air it couldn't get. He kept a paper calendar taped inside a folded box, marking every night he stayed and every dollar he spent, not because anyone told him to, but because seeing the numbers written down made the whole thing feel less like drifting and more like a plan. 18 nights in, he'd spent $31 total on the setup. Floor, walls, batteries, blanket, $31 on top of the $50 he'd paid for the unit itself. Small things started mattering again in a way they hadn't when he was sleeping wherever he landed. He kept his one change of clothes folded instead of balled up in a bag. He lined up his shoes by the door the way he used to in the apartment. Out of habit more than necessity, he used a plastic bin from the dollar store to separate what he owned from what belonged to the previous tenant, a line he was careful never to blur, because taking someone else's leftover belongings felt like a different kind of theft than paying $50 at a public auction. There wasn't much to organize. That was the point. Having 4 walls gave him somewhere to put the little bit he did have, and having somewhere to put it made him feel less like a person things happened to. The facility almost caught him in week 3, a maintenance worker doing a walkthrough for a water leak. 2 units down stopped at 214 because the roll-up door was sitting lower than the others on the row usually sat, low enough to look deliberate instead of just left open by accident. Cody heard the golf cart from 2 rows away before he saw it. The particular whine of the electric motor, different from any car engine, and by the time the cart turned onto his row, he'd already shoved the blanket and the stack of batteries behind the water-damaged boxes and slipped out through the 2-inch gap under the door. He was standing in the aisle, not inside the unit, when the worker pulled up and knocked on the metal anyway out of habit. Cody told him he was just grabbing something for his uncle, who rented the unit and worked nights. The worker glanced past him at the stack of ruined boxes near the door, saw exactly the kind of abandoned junk he expected to see in a unit like that, and didn't push it any further. He had a leak 2 doors down to find in unit. 214 wasn't on his clipboard. There was no chase, no confrontation, nothing that made for a dramatic moment. The man drove off to solve an actual problem, and Cody stood in the aisle for a full minute afterward before he let himself breathe normally again. Most of the danger in his situation wasn't a person hunting for him. It was the ordinary churn of a business running its ordinary day, and him needing to stay 1/2 step outside of it without ever making that half step obvious. By May, he had a system. Day labor in the mornings when trucks came in, the library in the afternoons when they didn't, back over the fence after 10, out again before 6. He picked up a second income source, almost by accident, helping Wallace's crew haul debris on weekends for cash. And within 6 weeks, he had enough saved that he stopped worrying about whether he could afford bus fare and started worrying about something else entirely. Whether staying in a storage unit indefinitely was actually a plan, or just a slower way of standing still. That question came to a head in June, not because of any single crisis, but because Perry disappeared for 4 days and turned up in a hospital bed at Toledo Mercy with frostbite damage to 2 fingers on his left hand. It hadn't even been that cold by winter standards, 40 degrees and raining, but a cold rain with no shelter for a full night does more damage than a dry freeze most people would guess is worse. Cody took 2 buses to go see him. Perry looked smaller in the hospital bed than he did behind his shopping cart, his bandaged hand resting on top of the blanket like it belonged to someone else. "They're saying I might lose part of the 1 finger," Perry said, not looking for sympathy, just stating it the way he stated most things. Cart got left outside the shelter door. Didn't seem worth dragging in for 1 night. Cody didn't say anything comforting because there wasn't anything comforting to say that would have meant much. Instead, he told him about the batteries, where the crews dumped the ones that still held a partial charge, which pawn shop on Airport Highway sold the cheap charging docks, and how to wire a 12-volt heated blanket off them instead of a car outlet. He told him flat out, more than once, never to bring anything that burned into a space with no airflow, no matter how cold it got, because a body that's cold can still wake up and move, but a body breathing carbon monoxide in its sleep usually doesn't get the chance. That was the whole conversation. No speech, no lecture. Perry took it the way you take directions from someone who's already walked the road once and knows where it's uneven. A nod, and a quiet promise to figure out his own version of it once his hand healed enough to work with wire again. Cody stayed in Unit 214 for 4 more months after that. Not because the storage unit was the destination, but because it was the first stable floor he'd had under him in almost a year. And a stable floor is what lets a person save money instead of just surviving day to day. Every dollar he wasn't spending on a motel room or a bus ticket to nowhere in particular was a dollar that stayed saved. By October, he had enough for a deposit on a room above a laundromat on Dorr Street, month to month, no lease, but a door that locked from the inside and didn't require climbing a fence at 11 at night to reach it. He gave notice on the unit the ordinary way. He walked into the office on a Tuesday afternoon, paid what he owed on the account his uncle's name was still attached to on paper, and let the woman in the polo shirt know he'd cleared everything out. She checked a box on a form and thanked him for his business. She never knew what the unit had actually held for 7 months, and there was no reason she would have. As far as the paperwork was concerned, Unit 2014 was just an account that had finally caught up and closed out clean. The last thing Cody did before locking it up for the final time wasn't packing. It was standing in the empty space for a minute, looking at the marks on the concrete where the pallet had sat, the clamp holes in the drywall where the moving blankets had hung, the outline on the floor that was slightly less dusty than the rest because something had been sitting there for 7 months. None of it looked like much. It never had. That was most of the point. None of it happened in one dramatic turn. It was a floor pallet, then a blanket on the wall, then a stack of dead batteries nobody else wanted, then a conversation with a guy who needed the setup more than Cody did by the time he was ready to pass it along. Put together, that's the whole story. A $50 auction bid, $31 in scavenged fixes, and 7 months that turned into the difference between drifting and having a plan. If you want to do one thing with this, it doesn't have to be big. Most shelters and outreach programs aren't short on blankets in the way people assume. They're short on the small stuff nobody thinks to bring: hand warmers, socks, batteries, phone chargers. Check what your local shelter is actually asking for this week before you donate anything, because the list changes and the thing they need most is rarely the thing that makes a good photo.